Okay, we have our final presentation for the morning with Marie-Isabelle Thouin-Savard, who is an MA student in the East West Psychology program, and her interests are sexuality and relationships, expansions of consciousness, and collective transformation. She has a master's and bachelor's in business. Here is where you found yourself here. I'd love to hear about that. And the title of our presentation today is Sex, Self-Transcendence, and Collective Transformation Towards a New Paradigm of Human Sexuality.
Hello everyone. Thanks for coming. So yes, today we're going to talk about my three favorite subjects in the world: sex, self-transcendence, and collective transformation, and how they relate to each other. First I'm going to, stem out of what's really going on right now, which is our planetary crisis, ecological devastation, and so on. So what a lot of our eco-philosophers have been talking about is the need to reconnect. That's what Sam was talking about a little bit earlier. That's what we're all talking about. Like he says that we have defined ourselves as other than what we are, as discrete subjects separate from each other and separate from the world around us. And that is the root of our being disconnected from nature and feeling like we have the right to pillage it and use it as something separate from us. And a lot of people who are talking about that separation will also make the connection with being separated from our root chakra, and that's how we make the connection with sexuality. Von Lee also talks about the need for bringing back sacredness in our lives and all aspects of our life. He says the deepest part of our separateness comes from from creation, lies in our forgetfulness of its sacred nature, which is also our own sacred nature. So bringing back, that attitude of reverence to life itself, could be like pivotal in creating solutions for the planet. So why is sexuality important in a time of crisis? I come from the assumption that sex is our vital force of generativity. It's the source of being alive. So that's really, sex is where we come from. So sexuality as life is the philosophy that I come from, which has been written about a lot by Sam Malkemis and Marina Romero, who also teach here at CIS. Joanna Macy in her book, talks about the disconnection from the root chakra. To be cut off from this root chakra robs us from our birthright to deep ecstatic connections within the web of life. And that's a factor that's contributing to the time of crisis. So as such, being disconnected from our sexuality implies a separation from life itself, from ourselves, from natures, and from each other. My research, to put it in more manageable terms, I put it as harnessing the potentials of sexuality as a gateway towards self-transcendence can foster ecologically sustainable and altruistic attitudes and behaviors in an individual. So it's basically talking about a different way of even approaching sexuality, and really, approaching it from a sacred place so that we can really harness the transformative potentials instead of just, again, approaching it as a separate thing and one of those things that we do, but more as a vital part of ourselves. So first I want to talk about the things that are keeping us, separate from our sexuality ideologically in our culture. The first thing that's very obvious is the association of sex with shame. In our Judeo-Christian culture, it's very, very deep, even though we mostly, like in the Bay Area, have been doing a lot of work to free ourselves from that, and in other parts of the world, of course, but it definitely trickles down. A lot of our, spiritual upbringing in the West, says that there is antagonism between sex and spiritual development, so that we need to keep sex, an instinct, as separate and hidden from the rest of our life, instead of integrating it as an area of opportunity. So we reduce sexuality as something dirty, like even in our language, like talking dirty is supposed to, mean talking, sexual and talking about turn on, but why do we use the word dirty? Sex is for procreation and biological necessity only, a necessary evil. So basically there's still sex education in our country that promotes abstinence only, which says that you should only have sex for procreation and biological purposes, and totally ignores the transformative potentials of sexual pleasure. Only a limited sets of behaviors and lifestyles are considered okay. There's no real freedom in gender roles and behaviors. And then if you put something in a context of shame, there's also difficulties in communication that arise. So, like people don't really talk about what, like pleases them and what can satisfy them, and it creates a lot of frustrations in a lot of couples and a lot of relationships, and that leads to just a lot of negative emotions, which, really connect with what we're in, collectively. Second, sex is dangerous, is the fear-based education that we receive. If we don't receive a abstinence-based education, we normally receive a so-called comprehensive sexual education, which is mostly just about the dangers of having sex. So I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't teach people about STDs and about, like the risks that are being taken and how to be precautious, but it's basically very disproportional. The way that we talk about sex is just, about, yes, if you trust the wrong person, you're going to get sick, you're going to die, you can get pregnant and you're going to have to go through an abortion. And that's hammered in a way that's just like instills in us that feeling that, like sex is dangerous, like it instills that fear, from a very young age in relation to our own instincts. It makes us feel like we cannot trust ourselves. And again, it makes us makes us feel like we cannot really trust nature and our own nature from the inside out. And sex is medicalized, like the fact that women have to birth their child in hospital, make again, like that beautiful thing, that should be sacred. It should be a sacred space where we birth our children, but, it gets associated with sickness and disease. It's very, very distorted, and I think it really plays with our psyche at a deep level. And then, because we also are trying to counterbalance the shame factor, we do what we do in the West is kind of putting sex in a pedestal as a commodity. Again, it's trying to promote it and, like make it seem like a sexual liberation, but it's more like a commodification and a objectification of sex. So mainstream psychology says that the pinnacle of sexual development is the ability to have mutually pleasurable sex with a partner, generally with orgasm on a regular basis, which sounds pretty good, but again, it's very limited. It's a specific way of picturing what sex should look like, and anything outside of that is considered a failure or a dysfunction. So we pathologize, like different ways of approaching sexuality. The recreational use of sex, I like to kind of compare it with recreational use of drugs, like if you use something that has a potential to expand your consciousness tremendously as something recreational, well, it's kind of like using an airplane to fly to Berkeley. It's very cumbersome and it's not really harnessing the power of what we've been given. Sex as performance versus co-creation. So again, sex becomes a way of performing rather than participating in an experience. We become consumers rather than participants. When I hear a lot of people going on a dating scene, like they are like, okay, what can this person give to me? They don't approach it in terms of what can I bring to this relationship? Like what magic can be created and where can we go from there? It's really much about having a picture of what that sexuality should look like and trying to match it, and anything besides that, again, is considered failure, which is very sad. It's very sad. It leads to a lot of anxiety, a lot of feelings of inadequacy, and just people going through life feeling like disconnected and unfulfilled. No wonder we have a planetary crisis. Alternative paradigms. So there are some societies which approach sex in a different way. A lot of Eastern societies like China, Japan, India, Rome, and Muslim societies throughout history. If you want to read something really good about that, Michel Foucault has the history of sexuality and makes a very good contrast between more westernized, like scientific ways of approaching sexuality and more inclusive, more spiritual ways of approaching sexuality. So in Ars Erotica, sex is viewed as an art form. So it's a way to discover the unknown and to tap into our creative energy. And it's also considered a spiritual practice. So it's an embodied way to transcend our ego boundaries rather than reinforce them. So in that paradigm, there's no separation between one's sexuality and one's spirituality. Sex is really considered as an integral part of life and development. There's also the concept that pleasure is really what can be, where truth can be drawn from. Its intensity, duration, and reverberations in the body and soul. So if you talk about reverberations, you're actually talking about transformation and how ecstasy can be transformative, can be a space of self-transcendence where change can happen and growth can happen. So the actual etymology of the word ecstasy talks about a state of standing outside of the normal flow of awareness. So it directly points to self-transcendence. So moving into what self-transcendence actually is, and coming back to my thesis that, like harnessing sexuality as a gateway to self-transcendence can create altruism and environmentally responsible behaviors. We need to define self-transcendence. And there's a lot of good literature in transpersonal psychology about self-transcendence. Albert Garcia Romero did his dissertation a few years ago on that, and he defines it as both a process of expansion or movement beyond one's immediate self-boundaries and a quality that emerges as a result of this process, developing into a generally stabilized and broader worldview, so I can pronounce. So it's a momentary experience, also could be called a peak experience or a mystical experience, which has for consequence of leaving you with that heightened view of reality. So you have that temporary experience, but then it changes you, and it can translate into more stabilized structure of personality. So the phenomenology of self-transcendent experiences includes somatic manifestations, shivering, laughing, etc., perceptual alterations, like going beyond time and space perceptually, and cognitive and affective shifts. So joy, love, compassion, forgiveness, wonder, and a generally different way of approaching your spirituality. And just want to mention that sometimes, it doesn't have to be positive. A lot of self-transcendent experiences, if they're not integrated well, can, be destructive or destructive in ways that are not necessarily good. So I don't want to romanticize the concept, but I also want to emphasize the opportunity that lays in it. As a personality construct, Pamela Reed has defined self-transcendence as the capacity to expand the boundaries intrapersonally, so towards a greater awareness of one's philosophy, values, and dreams. Interpersonally, so to relate to other people's and their environment. Temporally, to integrate one's past and future in a way that has meaning for the present. And transpersonally, so to connect with dimensions beyond the typically discernible world. So this is something that we're going to see in a moment, can have really great consequences in how we act towards each other and towards the environment. So how does self-transcendence relate to social transformation? Hoot and Friedman did an empirical study comparing people's score on 3 scales: the connectedness to nature scale, the consideration of future consequences scale, and the self-transcendence scale, and they had for result that they all correlated. So the more someone will embody qualities of stabilized self-transcendence, the more they will show altruism and environmentally sustainable behaviors. So that's, you know, like the logical way in which it connects. And also through seeing the world as interconnected. So that's basically like the key here, you know, like when you have a self-transcendent experience, you know, like you see the whole world as being interconnected, so you do care about other beings, just like what Sam was saying, you know, you care about other beings as you care about yourself, because you know that hurting something else or somebody else is like hurting yourself. Roland Griffiths also did a lot of study with psilocybin and self-transcendent states, where he gave massive dose of, yes, 5 minutes? Okay. A dose of psilocybin to someone in the lab, and then 14 months later would study their changes in behaviors, and also he went beyond self-report. He asked their loved ones and their coworkers, you know, like, did you notice change in that person? And yes, you know, like people who had that kind of mystical experience would show enhanced positive changes in attitudes, mood, life satisfaction, behaviors, altruism, and social effects. And then Ken Ring also, in his study of near-death experiences, observed that participants, a lot of them mutated from their pre-NDE personalities into more loving and compassionate people after the peak event. So these are all indications that self-transcendence, you know, can lead to enduring changes in behaviors that can be good for the planet and for humanity. So how does sexual energy actually can be fostered? How is sexual energy a gateway towards embodied self-transcendence and interconnectedness? There's many ways in which it can be that. So there's spontaneous experiences of self-transcendence. So Jenny Wade studied 86 people. It was a huge study of people who had spontaneously occurring experiences of transcendent sex. Two factors consistently emerge: the phenomenological experiences of an altered state, so oftentimes merging, kundalini awakening, past life experience, out-of-body experiences, visions, etc. And then the felt experience of a cosmic force engaging one or both lovers in the context of their relationship, especially their lovemaking. So very fitting in, you know, the context of self-transcendent experiences. Now, like, how can you foster that, you know, deliberately, if it doesn't happen to you spontaneously, if you're not that lucky? John Elfers had a beautiful study about people who would consciously foster ecstatic potentials inherent in sexuality, and did a very deep study of 8 individuals and found a transpersonal connection with a force beyond the self, and a dissolving of boundaries of the self was one of the main results of that, and then also shifting in sexual and spiritual values and understanding, precipitating a deliberate self-initiated journey of growth focused on wholeness and healing. So there's definitely, you know, ways where you can apply your intention to transcendence. And then Blavatsky went beyond that and said, you know, you don't even have to have sex. The erotic nature of life is accessible whether you're going to be celibate, you know, practice brahmacharya, whether you're practitioner of tantra, or you're just practitioner of orgasmic sex. So the nature of eros is actually transcendence. It's that place of mystery. It's that place of getting closer to the hidden. So that's the essential sexual act, and we all have access to that power, to that space of transcendence, you know, like inside of ourselves through our sexuality. So I really like that, you know, like, because everyone has a different way of approaching their sexuality, but they can all foster that power in that spiritual way. So Jorge also talks about sensual pleasure as embodied spirituality. In the same way that pain contracts the body, pleasure relaxes it, making it more porous to the presence and flow of both immanent and transcendent spiritual energies. In this light, the formidable magnetic force of the sexual drive can be seen as attracting consciousness to matter, facilitating both its embodiment and the development of an incarnational process that transforms both the individual and the world. So there's something about sensual pleasure that heals the split, you know, between mind and matter, that heals the the dualism that's keeping us disconnected from nature. And he also talks about love. Furthermore, the recognition of the spiritual import of physical pleasure naturally heals the historical split between sensuous love and spiritual love. And this integration fosters the emergence of generally human love, an unconditional love that is simultaneously embodied and spiritual. And I'm bringing this in, and I'm almost done. I'm bringing this in because I feel like love is really like the essence of self-transcendence and dissolution of ego boundaries. And what better way to foster that, than our erotic nature? I feel, it's like we have the equipment, we have the natural ability to do that. And overall, it is what is needed to heal that disconnection that we're feeling towards the earth, and to, consider sex as being something outside of ourselves and make it into a commodity is just foregoing that enormous opportunity to reconnect both personally, interpersonally, and cosmologically. So future directions really quickly. So it would be great to have empirical studies that actually measure long-term effects of people harnessing the potentials of sex as a great gateway to self-transcendence. So do the same kind of study that they did with psychedelics, like Griffiths, and do a long-term study on that. And come up with a different definition of what optimal sexual development is. I think transpersonal psychology can pave the path to that. Something alternative to the mainstream definition, and also change the way that we approach sexual education. Like what does comprehensive sexual education really mean? How can we talk about emotions? How can we talk about spirituality in relation to sex in a way that can feel good to most people? So that's it.
Questions?
I have one data set from Jenny Wade's work that you so well quoted, and that is that people who had trauma, in her sample of 86 people, were more likely to have transcendent sexual experiences, more frequent, intense, and for longer duration. So I want to pose a hypothesis to you, Marie, and see what you think. What if the trauma of what we go through in separation, let alone the trauma of abuse, is inducing a capacity for transcendent sex that may not have been here a few millennia ago? Could you imagine a part of human evolution that from trauma and separation we're actually finding a way through into elevated capacity and connection?
Yes. Yeah, I definitely feel like that's a beautiful hypothesis. I mean, I feel like that's the case. I feel like the need for self-transcendence is heightened right now. I mean, not just the need, but the opportunity for it. Yeah, because we're so, I guess, disconnected. I mean, I'm not sure if we used to just have more naturally occurring self-transcendence, and now we don't, so it's more like there's a gap that can be filled. Or if, we're actually moving into a different era of our consciousness that is calling to be more transcendent, but I feel like it is. I feel like we're being called to move on in a space where we are embodying that kind of, like that we're not confined in our egos anymore. So yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, one more question. Did you have any hand raised?
I just was going to ask a little bit more about the Elvers study.
Yes.
Just if you had anything more to add to what Elvers was finding.
It's a beautiful study, and I'm happy to just email it to you. I mean, it was an interpretive phenomenology, so he had like 3 different interviews with each of his 8 participants, so very much in depth. And that was basically, like getting to, like what happens when sex is sacred. Like what is the difference between, people who would just, like not really give sex much of a thought in terms of their spiritual development versus people who would really take sex as a spiritual practice. And you know, like I can't remember if they were all from like the same like kind of lineage or ideology. I think they were mostly, you know, embracing Tantra. But I'll have to look deeper and get back to you about really like who those people were.
Oh, that's amazing.
But yeah, I'll email you that study.
Yeah, it's
amazing.
Any other questions or comments?
Yeah. You mentioned sexual shame and shaming at the beginning. I wonder, do you see that as a hindrance to transcendence, or at which point can we overcome that on that path? And I'm asking specifically in regards to raising kids, for example. Do we have to teach those, you know, teach sex or teach like an anti-shaming process that is so, you know, otherwise ingrained from society? I wonder how you would see that.
Well, I think that if, you know, like parents don't embody shame, then they're not going to have to teach like anti-shame. They're just going to kind of teach by example. So the first thing to do is to get rid of, you know, of shame inside of ourselves. But you mentioned something about, you asked if shame was a conducer to more self-transcendence?
They are a hindrance. Like, do we have to overcome it first, or do you think it's something that can go pretty quickly?
I don't think it can be that quick. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you know, again, you know, like self-transcendent experiences can really open the veil and, you know, like make rapid change happen. But for it to be really integrated, you know, like to get rid of, you know, like lifetimes maybe of shame, or, you know, at least one lifetime of conditioning, I think it's not easy. I think it takes, you know, a lot of, you know, conscious awareness and practice and having people, you know, supporting us. But yeah, I think it definitely is a big hindrance to harnessing self-transcendence.
Thank you so much, Marie.